There was no explosion at first, no invading army crossing the horizon, no sudden catastrophe powerful enough to stop the machinery of modern civilization in a single day. The crisis everyone saw coming arrived differently, quietly, gradually, like water slipping beneath a locked door while the people inside continued eating dinner, watching television, going to work, and planning futures that no longer existed. Experts had warned about it for years. Economists debated it on television. Scientists published reports filled with numbers nobody wanted to remember. Politicians promised solutions during elections and abandoned them immediately after. Entire generations grew up surrounded by warnings severe enough to reshape humanity itself. Yet daily life remained strangely normal. Supermarkets stayed full. Highways remained crowded. Lights still illuminated cities during the night. And that illusion of stability became the most dangerous part of all. Because collapse rarely begins with panic. It begins with routine. It begins when society learns to live beside growing danger for so long that fear slowly transforms into background noise. In the years before the breakdown became undeniable, daily life across the industrialized world appeared almost untouched by the tensions building beneath the surface. Cafes remained full during mornings. Financial districts glowed with confidence. Families planned vacations. Students graduated from universities. Corporations announced record profits. And millions continued believing that technological progress alone would somehow neutralize every threat ahead. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, invisible fractures were multiplying everywhere at once. Supply chains became increasingly fragile. Housing costs rose faster than wages. Entire populations accumulated debt simply to preserve ordinary lifestyles. Governments borrowed against futures they could no longer realistically sustain. And while many citizens sensed that something fundamental was changing, few understood how deeply interconnected the failures had already become. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began with exhaustion. Systems designed for stability became dependent on permanent growth, permanent consumption, and permanent confidence. And when confidence itself started weakening, the foundations underneath modern civilization began trembling silently. Prices climbed slowly at first, almost invisibly, until ordinary necessities became sources of quiet anxiety inside millions of homes. Families changed habits without fully admitting why. Meals became smaller, purchases were delayed, people worked longer hours simply to maintain the same standard of living they had possessed years earlier. But no one wanted to call it collapse yet. Governments avoided the word because markets depended on optimism. Media organizations softened language to avoid panic. Even citizens themselves resisted acknowledging the scale of the danger, because modern society had conditioned them to believe that every crisis would eventually correct itself. But this time was different. The crisis everyone saw coming was dangerous, precisely because it unfolded slowly enough for denial to survive beside undeniable evidence. As tensions deepened, institutions responded not with transformation, but with preservation. Leaders focused on protecting appearances rather than addressing structural weakness. Emergency measures became permanent policies, temporary debt expanded into impossible obligations, public trust eroded gradually as promises stopped matching reality, elections grew more hostile, protests became larger, entire populations started dividing into separate versions of truth, each convinced the other represented the real threat. Social cohesion weakened, not because people suddenly changed, but because prolonged instability amplifies fear, and fear reshapes how societies interpret reality itself. Meanwhile, the physical signs of strain became harder to hide. Water shortages spread across agricultural regions. Infrastructure aged faster than governments could repair it. Energy systems faced growing interruptions. Insurance companies abandoned vulnerable territories entirely. But even then, daily life continued. Children still attended school. Businesses still opened each morning. People still posted photographs online, pretending everything remained stable. By the time the signs became impossible to dismiss, entire systems were already operating beyond recovery. The financial unraveling accelerated in ways few citizens immediately understood. Modern economies had become dependent on endless confidence, and confidence is among the most fragile resources ever created by civilization. Banks survived because people believed they would survive. Currencies held value because populations trusted governments to maintain stability. Markets rose because investors assumed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. But once enough people began questioning that assumption, panic spread faster than institutions could respond. Investment collapsed, businesses reduced operations, layoffs expanded across industries once considered untouchable. Retirement savings vanished within months. Entire middle classes discovered that decades of work could disappear through mechanisms too complex for most people to fully understand. The collapse did not arrive as a single dramatic event broadcast worldwide. It arrived through countless private realizations happening simultaneously inside apartments, offices, and supermarkets. Quiet moments where ordinary people stared at prices, bank accounts, or empty shelves and understood something irreversible had already begun. Cities changed first, not through sudden destruction, but through visible decay spreading block by block. Public transportation weakened as funding collapsed. Crime increased unevenly, often driven less by violence than desperation. Homeless encampments expanded beneath highways and near financial districts that once symbolized prosperity. Small businesses disappeared behind permanently closed metal shutters. Ambulance sirens became constant background noise in neighborhoods abandoned by long-term investment. Yet even during this deterioration, fragments of normal life persisted everywhere. Restaurants still served dinners by candlelight during rolling blackouts. Office workers still attended meetings discussing quarterly projections, while infrastructure around them slowly failed. That contradiction became one of the defining characteristics of the crisis. Civilization rarely collapses all at once. Different parts fail at different speeds. Some communities maintained relative order, while others deteriorated rapidly. But no region remained completely isolated from the growing instability. The systems connecting modern society had become so intertwined that weakness in one area eventually infected everything else. Governments increasingly relied on control rather than confidence. Surveillance expanded under the justification of maintaining order. Emergency powers remained active long after their original purpose disappeared. Public frustration intensified as authorities appeared simultaneously stronger and more powerless than ever before. Leaders delivered speeches promising stability while quietly preparing for scenarios they no longer believed could be prevented. Military presence around infrastructure increased, borders hardened, supply distribution became politicized, information itself transformed into a battlefield where truth became difficult to separate from manipulation. But no one understood what was coming next. Because beneath the visible economic and political instability, another crisis had already begun reshaping civilization at a deeper level. Trust, the invisible force holding societies together, was collapsing faster than any currency or institution. Neighbors viewed each other with suspicion. Citizens stopped believing official statements. Experts lost credibility, regardless of accuracy. And once collective trust begins disintegrating, even functioning systems struggle to survive. The environmental pressures that had accumulated for decades now intensified the instability everywhere simultaneously. Rivers shrank, fisheries collapsed, agricultural cycles became unpredictable. Entire regions faced alternating floods and droughts severe enough to destabilize food production itself. Scientists had warned for generations that interconnected ecological systems could eventually reach irreversible tipping points. Yet political systems designed around short-term survival consistently delayed meaningful action. By the time governments attempted large-scale responses, resources were already strained by economic instability and social fragmentation. Migration accelerated as millions abandoned regions no longer capable of sustaining human life at previous scales. Cities unprepared for rapid population shifts faced overwhelming pressure on housing, healthcare, sanitation, and employment. Fear transformed migrants into political symbols rather than human beings, deepening division inside already unstable nations. The collapse everyone saw coming was no longer theoretical. It became visible in crowded shelters, dried reservoirs, abandoned farmland, and the growing silence of ecosystems once considered permanent. Inside ordinary homes, the psychological effects became impossible to ignore. Constant uncertainty altered human behavior in subtle but devastating ways. Anxiety disorders surged, birth rates declined, Relationships fractured under financial and emotional pressure. People stopped imagining long-term futures because the future itself no longer felt reliable. Entire generations developed a permanent sense of instability, growing up in societies where every institution appeared exhausted, reactive, and fragile. Entertainment became both escape and sedation, allowing populations to temporarily disconnect from realities they felt powerless to change. Yet beneath that distraction existed a growing awareness impossible to fully suppress. The routines sustaining modern life were becoming increasingly artificial. Food arrived through vulnerable systems. Electricity depended on aging infrastructure. Medicine relied on global supply networks already under strain. And once people began realizing how thin the barrier between order and breakdown truly is, society itself starts behaving differently. Fear spreads not only through disaster, but through anticipation of disaster. Some communities attempted adaptation. Local agriculture returned in regions abandoned by industrial systems. Neighborhood networks formed to distribute resources and share protection. Small groups rediscovered skills once considered obsolete. Repairing tools, preserving food, generating local energy, purifying water. In many places, survival depended less on wealth than cooperation. Yet cooperation itself remained fragile inside societies shaped by decades of hyper-individualism and distrust. The collapse revealed not only weaknesses in infrastructure, but weaknesses in cultural assumptions about progress, consumption, and human behavior. Entire populations had been taught that markets alone could organize civilization indefinitely. But markets could not manufacture social cohesion. They could not restore trust. They could not guarantee sacrifice for future generations. As larger systems weakened, humanity confronted an ancient reality hidden beneath modern complexity. Civilization survived not merely through technology, but through shared belief in collective responsibility. And by then, that belief had already been severely damaged. The international order fragmented slowly before collapsing openly. Alliances weakened under resource pressure. Nations prioritized domestic survival over global cooperation. Trade routes became increasingly unstable, as fuel shortages, political conflicts, and infrastructure failures disrupted transportation networks that once connected continents seamlessly. Military tensions escalated near strategic waterways and resource-rich territories. Smaller conflicts multiplied around the edges of collapsing regions, often ignored until their consequences spread outward through migration, famine, or economic shockwaves. Yet, the most unsettling aspect of the crisis was not warfare itself. It was normalization. Humanity adapted psychologically to instability with frightening speed. News broadcasts discussing shortages, disasters, and displacement became routine background noise. Children grew up considering rolling blackouts and water restrictions ordinary parts of life. The collapse did not feel cinematic for those living through it. It felt administrative, bureaucratic, gradual. Civilization eroded through spreadsheets, delayed maintenance, exhausted workers, and political paralysis, long before visible ruins appeared. Historians later argued endlessly about the exact moment the irreversible decline truly began. Some pointed toward financial decisions made decades earlier. Others blamed environmental negligence, political polarization, unsustainable consumption, technological dependency, or demographic pressure. But the deeper truth remained more disturbing. The crisis everyone saw coming had no single cause because modern civilization itself had become a network of interdependent vulnerabilities. Every system depended on another system functioning perfectly. Energy sustained agriculture. Agriculture sustained cities. Cities sustained economies. Economies sustained governments. Governments sustained infrastructure. And once enough pressure disrupted several layers simultaneously, recovery became increasingly impossible. Collapse emerged not from one fatal blow, but from cumulative fragility hidden beneath the illusion of permanent stability. By the time leaders recognized the full scale of the danger, the systems capable of coordinated response had already lost the strength required to reverse it. Long after the height of the crisis passed, the world that emerged looked profoundly different from the one that existed before. Entire coastlines had been abandoned. Former economic centers lost influence permanently. Populations redistributed across safer territories. Smaller regional systems replaced vast global dependencies in many areas. Future generations studied the period not merely as an economic disaster or environmental emergency, but as a civilizational turning point, revealing the limits of unchecked expansion. And perhaps the most haunting lesson was this: humanity was not destroyed by ignorance. The warnings existed, the data existed, the predictions existed. People saw the danger approaching for years, sometimes decades, but seeing collapse is not the same as preventing it, because the greatest weakness of advanced civilizations is often their inability to sacrifice immediate comfort in order to preserve long-term survival. And by the time enough people finally accepted the reality of the crisis, the age they were trying to save had already disappeared forever.